Hello, everyone.
Okay.
I'm hoping that you can hear me. Hello, it's lovely to see your faces, some of you. Okay. Ned, can you indicate if you can hear me or not?
Oh, yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. Okay, so I think we'll start. I think there are still some more people joining us in the next few minutes, but I think we can make a start now. So first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for being here. And let me extend a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Irish Association for American Studies. I'm Catherine Gander. I'm the chair of the IAAS, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this year's annual W.A. Emmerson Lecture. Before I do, we do have a few small housekeeping items. The first is that the lecture will last around 35 to 40 minutes. We will mute your microphones. And if you have your microphone on now, I would ask you to mute it, please. Otherwise you get a lot of feedback. So you'll find the button for your microphone at the bottom of your screen. There are 4 icons at the bottom of your screen, and one of them is a microphone icon. If you click that, you'll be able to mute your microphone. So if everyone could do that just for a moment, that would be fantastic. Thank you. You can turn on your mics, of course, and your cameras at the end of the lecture to offer Dr. Young a big round of applause, and we would ask you to do that. There will be a question and an answer session after the lecture. If you have a question, we would ask you to indicate in the chat function your question. So we're using Blackboard Collaborate, which is a little bit different from what you might be used to, Zoom or Teams or something like that. So to get to the chat function, you click the little purple tab in the bottom right corner of your screen, and then you click on the speech bubble icon. And your question, you can type your question into the chat there, and it will be read and then posed to Nerys at the end of the lecture by our fantastic moderator for the lecture, Dr. Ciara Chambers. And so I'd like also to extend a warm welcome and a big thank you to Ciara Chambers, who is the head of film and screen media at University College Cork. In 2014, the IAAS established what became a tradition, an annual lecture given by an invited member of the island's American Studies community that would appeal to expert and non-expert audiences alike. In 2015, the lecture was renamed the W.A. Emmerson Lecture in honor of the association's much-loved treasurer and one of its founding members, the late Tony Emmerson. So the Emmerson Lecture is always a special occasion, and this year it is particularly special as we celebrate the association's 50th year. Many of you will know that Dr. Young was to deliver the lecture in March when plans were interrupted by something we've all become very familiar with. But we are very pleased to be able to go ahead with the lecture, obviously later than planned and certainly on a different platform, but still very much in the same celebratory energy that we had originally invested in the occasion. Dr. Nerys Young of Ulster University is our current much-loved treasurer. So I'll let our moderator, Ciara, introduce her properly to you, but let me say thank you again, Nerys, for your continuing hard work for that IAAS and for agreeing to share your research with us here this evening. And I'll hand over to Ciara. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine, and thank you so much for including me in this event. At the start of the year, I never would have anticipated attending a lecture in Coleraine by staying in Cork, but this is the world we live in now, and of course we have to take all opportunities for cross-border collaboration at the moment for various reasons. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Nerys Young, lecturer and first-year tutor in history at Ulster University Coleraine and course director of the outreach programme in English and History based in Newry. Nerys has also been ISEP and American Exchange Coordinator for the university. She was twice seconded as the Faculty of Arts Marketing Director, Before joining Ulster, she worked in the Arts and Culture Division of Queen's University, where she also taught. She was involved with the Belfast Festival at Queen's and the Queen's Film Theatre. She has organised not one but 3 international conferences in the last 6 years, and one of them, of course, for IAAS, and the other 2 as co-lead of the Guilty Pleasures in TV project, which was funded by the Big Lottery Fund. She is currently co-editing a special edition of the Journal of Popular Television with her colleague, Dr. Kate Byrne, in Guilty Pleasures and Masculinity in Television. And I have had a sneak preview into Nerys's talk this evening, and I'm really excited about what's to come for us all. So I will do my best to moderate at the end of the session and answer all of your questions. So at this point, I'll hand over to Ned to open the lecture.
Thank you very much, Kira. Thanks for that. I am super honoured to be asked to give the Emmerson Lecture this year. 1, because it's an honour in itself, but 2, because Tony was my mentor for 15 years. He was the course director when I was an undergrad doing American Studies, and after my PhD I was his TA for about 7 years and just really enjoyed working with him. When I got the job here and he retired, we continued to share an office, and he would come up on the train from Belfast once or twice a week, and we'd have a good chat, and he'd do the Sudoku, and he'd still see some students sometimes, and it was a really nice kind of relationship that I had with Tony. I wanted to tell one little Tony story because I've been thinking a lot about him in the run up to this. And I know Mary knows this story, so I'm not telling tales really. But Tony, even after retirement, Tony used to travel in America a lot. And anywhere he went to the bookshops and he bought books. And Mary had banned him from bringing any more books into the house. So he'd put them in parcels and send them to my office, care of me. And I'd get these parcels full of books and get all excited, but realise that they were for Tony. And then every week when he came up, he'd put 2 or 3 in his briefcase and smuggle them back into his basement study under Mary's nose. I'm quite sure that Mary knew it all the time, but he quite enjoyed sneaking these books back into the house. And I got to have a quick read of them before they left my office. So I miss Tony a lot, and it is a real honour to give this lecture today. So, let me share my slides with you. On the 5th of January 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver, a Democrat from Tennessee, formally introduced Senate Resolution 202 on the Senate floor, calling for the Committee on the Judiciary to investigate interstate gambling and racketeering activities and the use of the facilities of interstate commerce for the purposes of organised crime. He stressed that city crime commissions had been reporting on a national crime syndicate at work in America, and that Congress needed to investigate and gather information so they could legislate accordingly and intelligently. The newly formed subcommittee would be designated as the Special Committee to investigate organised crime in interstate commerce. It would become known as the Senate Crime Committee, or more often than not, Kefauver's Committee. The committee's work generated considerable public interest. The committee held hearings in Washington, D.C. and in 13 other cities across the country. They questioned governors and mayors and sheriffs, policemen, and more interestingly for the public, reputed underworld figures. The Senate Crime Committee hearings of 1950 and 51 became a national phenomena in the 50s. Not necessarily because of the startling new evidence that they uncovered, but because of their ability to collate snippets of information from the files of local and state police, federal agencies, the IRS, and then disseminate the extensive findings to a mass audience. Senator Estes Kefauver, his crime committee, and his investigative team were able to consolidate their research into an inclusive and convincing profile of organised crime syndicates in league across the nation, controlling everything from trucking to slot machines, racketeering, labour unions and puppet politicians. The Kefauver Committee's best resource had been its timing. David Halberstam has suggested that a year or 2 earlier and there would have been no audience. a few years later, and there might have been less excitement surrounding the hearings. That timing depended on television. A New Orleans station decided to bulk out its daytime programming schedule by broadcasting an hour of the hearings live. Such was its success, it led every city the Senate committee visited to abandon the daily schedules and continuously broadcast the live hearings. Thus, the Senate Crime Committee became the first continuously live Senate hearings to be televised to the American public. And the broadcasts were an astonishing sensation. So this lecture is going to look at Kefauver and the use of television with the Kefauver hearings, and also argue that the viewing public, conditioned by the continuous broadcasts on television, that this conditioning led the public to perceive and accept a new set of conventions of what gangsters in the crime genre for TV were actually like. Through the television screen, the public saw their appearance, what they wore, how they spoke, the type of language they used, how they behaved, and also learnt about the wide range of business interests which concern them. When the television industry attempted to capitalise on the popularity of the stories in the newspapers and on television, this lecture will argue that they had to change the way they represented the gangster character on screen in order to retain a believable character for a newly informed audience. So in 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver's reputation had not extended far beyond the confines of the Senate and his home state of Tennessee. And it seemed impossible that this pretty much anonymous senator would within a year be announcing a serious campaign to run for Democratic president in the 1952 elections. But it was possible. A new medium for raising public awareness and public profiles had been founded, and this medium was television. In 1946, only 6,500 television sets were manufactured for sale in America. Limited availability of programming, the high price of television apparatus and sets were all factors in whether this novelty would take off or be a mere fad. In 1947, televisions were a considerable investment, ranging from $375 to $500 in price. Added to this was the antenna installation, which ran from $45 to $300, depending on where you lived in relation to a transmitter. In 1949, televisions made their first appearance in the Sears robot catalogue and became a staple of American dream living. It quickly started to be a must-have item for any household. And some Americans who couldn't afford a television set would just have the antenna installed so that it would look like they could keep up with their neighbours. The idea of television's expansion as a popular medium can be seen in the following statistics. In 1946, less than 0.2% of all US homes had a television set. By 1951, this had risen to 23.5% and continued to rise so that in 1956 it had reached 64.5%. The television phenomenon continued, and by 1969 it had reached almost a 95% saturation of the American market. To place this rapid expansion into a more understandable context, if we compare television's expansion to that of US radio, then radio had taken over a decade to reach 33% saturation in US homes. Communication historian and ex-newsreel cameraman Ernest D. Rose has suggested that audiences tend to believe television news more than newspapers or radio, especially when stories in the two do not agree. Audiences tend to accept what they see on their home television screens as the truth, as a direct transmission of reality. Therefore, news events which appear on television can be seen to have a strong impact on the public's perceptions. Thus, the fifth Congressional Committee hearing ever to appear on television became, because of its sensational subject matter, being continuously televised live, the first major news event to transfix the American TV viewer. The early hearings had started off as closed sessions in Washington, where the panel had heard testimony from experts called to testify to their knowledge on certain key subjects. For example, Harry Anslinger from the FBN spoke on narcotics trafficking, and J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, discussed the local problems of organised crime. The open Crime Committee hearings started to run for public audiences from the 22nd of June 1950, and they very quickly created a high media profile. At first, radio had been covering the hearings, not just with sound bites during their news shows, but with some stations devoting hours to continuous coverage. It was later recorded that over 90% of radio audiences heard at least some portion of the Crime Committee's hearings. Movietone News and other independent newsreel companies recorded segments to appear on cinema screens, and some of these clips appeared on the evening television news shows. Compared with the first few months of untelevised public hearings, the presence of television at the hearings caused the tone of the proceedings to change. In the 2-month period of televised hearings, the mood of the publicity that the hearings was creating changed as well, and Kefauver quickly grew wary of television's coverage. The media, especially news magazines, peppered their crime hearing coverage with showbiz terms. The hearings referred to it as Kefauver's Circus, and column inches were titled The Kefauver Show, Kefauver Circus, and Biggest Show on Earth, which led Kefauver to worry that the content and key messages of the hearings were being overshadowed by the process of dissemination. This high level of public interest in the hearings affected many different areas of everyday life. Important blood and plasma donations bound for the wounded in Korea declined so rapidly once the Kefauver crime hearings arrived in New York City that the Red Cross telegrammed Kefauver and asked him to raise an appeal for the donors. The Brooklyn chapter of the Red Cross's blood drive donations dropped by half when its 35,000 housewives gave up their door-to-door soliciting of donors in favour of watching their television sets. Just before an intermission in the live broadcasting, Kefauver spoke from the panel table to encourage the public to donate blood once the session went on its break. Public response and donations were raised by 100%. The Brooklyn chapter's Blood Donation Centre also installed a television on their premises amongst their donation cots so that their donor volunteers would not miss any of the riveting Costello or O'Dwyer testimony. A Red Cross spokesman soon declared, "Our problem now is how to get the donors out of the room after they've given their point, and how to keep the staff from watching." The Manhattan chapter of the Red Cross organisation also considered installing a television set, but decidedly too undignified for them. Movie attendance was also adversely affected. Motion Picture Theatre spokesman reported that trade was severely down, and one claimed that the effects of the crime probe were worse than a double-header World Series. Some cinemas tried to show excerpts of the hearings in between their main features, but the audience howled for more. Finally, 2 movie houses gave up their scheduled film programming to screen the televised hearings full-time and free of charge. They took income from only the drinks and snacks that were sold at their candy counters. This picture shows the Marine Cinema in New York, which changed its huge advertising hoarding to read "Free to Public, Kefauver TV, Senate Crime Hearings," in the hopes of pulling in those New Yorkers without access to a television set. A spokesman for the Consolidated Edison Company of New York reported that there was a decided increase in electrical use, although he could not be positive that it was purely due to the increase in television service, since televisions were normally on that were normally off, but irons and vacuum cleaners that were usually in use remain unplugged. Dust gathered on floor and furniture as housewives were reportedly skimping on their household chores and offering their husbands no guarantee that dinner would be ready on time, as they invited their friends round for television watching parties. Maureen Remenay, a housewife from Arlington Heights, admitted that her routine housework had slipped, but she remarked, "At least I'm getting some darning done." She did, however, feel a little guilty about depriving her children of their regular daily programming so she could watch the hearings. 5-year-old Scoop was reported as moaning, "This thing's been on all day, and now I'm missing Howdy Doody." Husbands were also found to have slipped away from their jobs to any of the many bar restaurants, only too happy to pander to the mesmerised crime probe viewers as long as they remained thirsty and hungry. Loud groans and remarks of amazement permeated the saloon crowds of East Side television watchers at the amount of knowledge that Kefauver and his crime committee investigators had amassed on St. Louis crime, shown by the questions asked of some of the East Side witnesses. Comments such as, "How in did he ever find that out?" and "It looks bad, looks like he's got it all," proved to the public at least that this was no whitewash investigation. For those at home who felt a little hungry, it appeared that popcorn was the snack of choice whilst viewing, for the national sales of Pop's Right popcorn for home popping increased 112% during the week of the New York hearings. Shops and grocery stores appeared virtually deserted during what became known as the Kefauver hours, the period when the crime probe was shown on television, as thousands of housewives were apparently postponing their marketing. These same shops were then swamped when the hearing's noon lunch recess began. Department stores expecting their Easter rush were also quiet, but there were some people who found this to be an advantage, as a lighter moment in the hearing's testimony reveals. After receiving and reading out a letter from a husband thanking the committee for keeping his wife glued to the TV and out of the New York shops, Senator Toby remarked, "I might add, Mr. Chairman, I believe every husband in this room shares a sympathetic feeling with the author of that letter." Moments such as these provided a change of pace and brought lighter, almost comical interludes between the dull refusals of testimony, the lengthy opening statements of politicians caught up in the proceedings, and the dramatic bouts of interrogational questions directed at some of the witnesses testifying before the Senate committee. If you didn't own your own television, had no access to a friend's television, and couldn't afford to buy one, you still had the opportunity of viewing the hearings. People would gather round the sets in appliance store windows as crowds of televisions treated the hearings like a football game, cheering their heroes and booing the villains. In a later interview, Kefauver clarified his position on whether he saw testifying before the television as fair. "I think, speaking specifically of television, if the lights are not obtrusive and the heat is not obnoxious, unless there is some physical reason, it is all right to televise hearings. After all, it is a means of public information. I have a meeting in a very large room where a lot of people would come, and I can't see an awful lot of difference between that and letting people see it on television." Since there were no clear guidelines for the conduct of congressional hearings in general, nor any meaningful precedents on the presence of the media, Kefauver cautioned the television stations to ensure that they were unobtrusive and would keep their lighting indirect. Indirect lighting was actually a technique used in Hollywood for creating shadows and was often used to great effect in film noir movies. Its use in the hearing rooms could subconsciously have intensified the television audience's enthusiasm, as the live broadcasts may have subliminally reminded them of crime films they'd seen in the movie theatres. As the hype continued on the West Coast, the Los Angeles hearings now had 25 microphones on the table in front of the crime committee, so many in fact that there was no room for these notes or their briefcases. The crime committee, television stations and local and national newspapers received many favourable letters of congratulation for their input into the investigations. But there were critics who claimed that the Senate crime probe was a television extravaganza, staged with all the bright lights and tinny trappings of an amateur theatrical. They looked upon the Crime Investigating Committee as a roadshow FBI, in existence only to glorify Estes Kefauver. After the Crime Committee investigation, he was accused of inviting the television coverage deliberately for the sake of personal publicity. But it had been the television stations which had initiated the coverage. Although obviously the televising of the hearings made Kefauver and other members of the committee household names, television did have its drawbacks. It created tremendous tension for the committee panel, who were always conscious of the large audience listening and watching every movement, and so became much more conscious of their language and their actions. Aware of viewers' attention spans, they also felt the necessity for moving along with the testimony and not getting bogged down with the torturous details that these hearings always entailed. A tired panel of senators and investigators opened what was meant to be the last set of public hearings in New York in March 1951. For the panel, the media and the public, the 7 days of live televised hearings proposed in New York were set to be the pinnacle of the crime hearings. The proceedings were to be picked up by the New York television station WPIX Channel 11, using 4 television cameras in the courtroom of the Federal Building in Foley Square. They would in turn feed the programme to other television outlets. WPIX, WJZ-TV Channel 7 and WABD Channel 5 had all cancelled their daily programming schedules to show the hearings live and continuously all day. Meanwhile, 2 other stations showed highlights in the evenings or brief segments of the hearings in between other regular TV shows. WPIX simply kept their cameras trained on the key figures in the courtroom, switching from testifying witness to interrogating committee panel only as the action itself changed, and clearly defining the lines of supposed good and evil within the courtroom for the viewer at home, providing a strong sense of 2 elements in opposition. On the first day of the New York hearings, the New York Times estimated that television would be carried into the homes of 2,225,000 set owners in the metropolitan area alone. By the end of the New York phase, the crime hearings had also been televised throughout 20 cities along the eastern seaboard and well into the Midwest, giving a total national audience estimate of between 20 and 30 million people. One of the key witnesses lined up by the chief investigator for the Senate Crime Committee, Rudolph Halley, was alleged Prime Minister and kingpin of the underworld, Frank Costello, seen here in this picture on the left. Just as Hollywood gangster characters dressed to impress as they rose to the top of their gang organisations, Costello arrived in the hearing rooms in expensive-looking suits and ties, befitting his position as an alleged principal in the organised crime world. Before any questioning of Frank Costello could take place, however, Costello's lawyer, George Wolfe, spoke to the committee, and the committee discovered it had a problem. Mr. Wolfe: I am a member of the bar and I am appearing as attorney for Mr. Costello. I'd like to know if you intend to televise this proceeding. Senator O'Connor: The proceedings have been televised. May I ask whether you have an objection? Mr. Wolfe: Strenuously object. Senator O'Connor: Upon what basis do you register objection? Mr. Wolfe: On the ground that Mr. Costello doesn't care to submit himself as spectacle, and on the further ground that it will prevent proper conference with his attorney in receiving proper advice from his attorney during the course of the testimony. Now, in St. Louis, the bookie James Carroll's refusal to testify in front of television cameras had resulted in a citation for contempt of Congress. But Costello was too big a witness to dismiss in such a way, for Costello was rumoured to control the New York arm of the mafia, while masquerading as a simple businessman. A compromise was quickly reached, as the committee did not want to provide him with a reason to walk out. The compromise allowed Frank Costello to testify as long as the television cameras did not telecast his face whilst he was testifying. This led to some of the most unprecedented television, as hour after hour, instead of seeing the picture that you're seeing now on screen, the cameras were trained on simply his hands and arms and chest. Billed by the newspapers as the man in the cathode mask and television's first beheaded star, Costello's headless television footage was far from dull, as the movement of his fingers told their own emotional story. The radio and television editor of the New York Times, Jack Gould, followed the New York hearings and its involvement with television closely. His commentary on the television appearance of Costello's hands highlights the types of images the public found so enthralling. When the questions got rough, Costello crumpled a handkerchief in his hands, or he rubbed his palms together, or he interlaced his fingers, or he grasped a half-filled glass of water, or he beat a silent tattoo on the tabletop, or he rolled a little ball of paper between his thumb and index finger, or he stroked the side pieces of his glasses lying on the table. His was video's first ballet of the hands. But Costello's nervous and guilty hands confused the public as well. Having been educated about the underworld by Hollywood films, this nervousness seen in the hands was not the response they expected from a gangster in a tight corner. George Wolfe was not the only person unhappy with the arrangements in the courtroom. Francis McCall, Director of Television News and Special Events for NBC, respectfully requested that the committee reconsider its ruling, which prohibited the television cameras from photographing Costello's face. It appeared that Costello's continued testimony outweighed the television station's feelings of discrimination compared with other forms of media. For some television stations, the fact that television cameras were not permitted to shoot Costello's face became a moot point, as they simply replaced their television footage with material filmed by the movie newsreel cameras, who had no such restrictions. In the course of a regular evening news telecast, station WBNT simply broadcast some of the movie newsreel footage, and there was Costello, head, hands and all, testifying before the committee. Frank Costello and his lawyer George Wolfe continued to submit themselves as spectacle for the public audience, leaving the hearing rooms without permission not once but twice, with Wolfe claiming that his client had reached the limit of his physical and mental endurance. Although Costello was always dressed in a generally affluent manner, on his first day of testifying he arrived in a powder blue suit, as befitted the businessman image that he liked to promote. But his testimony was dotted with passages of low-grade literacy. His vocabulary and enunciation were those of a straw-boss stevedore. Both let his affluent business image down badly. Costello's appearance may have mirrored that of a stereotypical film gangster, but his attitude and demeanour did not. Other witnesses refused to testify before the committee. Jacob Greasy Thumb Guzik, reputed money handler for the late Al Capone, refused to answer questions on constitutional grounds, explaining time after time, "I refuse to answer, it might incriminate me." Guzik had appeared with no lawyer to offer him counsel, and Senator Wiley asked where he had learnt such a phrase. Guzik replied, "I heard it on television." The New York hearings included a femme fatale as well. As the former mistress of the late Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Mrs. Hans Hauser, more commonly known as Virginia Hill, knew the names and had met many of the characters who had already testified or been mentioned by those who testified before the crime hearings. When she swept into the courtroom to testify, wearing a tight black dress, large black-brimmed hat, and silver blue mink stole, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed significantly. She embodied the stereotype of the gangster's mole created by films from Hollywood, such as the resilient Panama Jack from the Roaring Twenties film. Unlike Costello, her incarnation did not end with her appearance. Her brash, upfront attitude was obvious, and her voice was strong and clear, with no hint of nervousness at testifying in front of the Senate committee or the television cameras. As she took her place at the witness table, the reporters wrangled their positions to get better photographs, and Hill's temper erupted. Ever the gentleman, Senator Kefauver tried to control the situation. "Chairman, now gentlemen, let us give Mrs. Hauser a chance to accustom herself without too many flashbulbs." Mr. Halley, Mrs. Hauser, make them quit doing that. Chairman, all right, let's not flash any more bulbs. Mrs. Hauser, I'll throw something at them in a minute. I hate those things. The solemnness of a Senate hearing appeared quite foreign to Hill as she spoke to the committee panel. With wild gesticulations, she attempted to answer each of Rudolph Halley's questions in a manner that gave the impression of someone being very, very dumb. Instead, she made you feel that she was very much the opposite. She seemed to enjoy her role in the hearings as she unfolded the fantastic story of how, without working, she managed to collect an annual income that ran into thousands of dollars from the men she was around, who, according to her, were definitely not gangsters. During the Senate Crime Committee hearings, it was the impact of television that had worried many of the corrupt Tammany district leaders. For most of the revealing information had already been discussed in previous investigations and documented in the newspapers. But whereas a great mass of the public in the past had just glanced at newspaper headlines, now for the last 8 days they had been seeing a real-life moving picture and had devoured the testimony, even to the neglect of sports pages and racing entries. As New York Times' reporter Jack Gould's comments on the relationship between television and the crime probe highlight, television's qualities of intimacy and immediacy have made the experience so personal that the TV viewer actually is closer to the scene than any spectator in the courtroom itself. Following the New York hearings and the Costello compromise, an earlier witness, James J. Carroll, who had been cited for contempt during the St. Louis hearings for refusing to testify in front of the television cameras, changed his mind to avoid the charges of contempt. Although the Washington, D.C. hearings were being televised, the cameras, as with Costello, were kept off Carroll's face, but he still felt their presence. as testimony between Carroll and Associate Committee Counsel John Burling demonstrates. Carroll: you see, you have injected the fright factor into this proceeding. Burling: the what? Carroll: fright, F-R-I-G-H-T factor. Burling: in other words, you are in fright at the moment. Carroll: that is correct, sir. I am speechless. The phenomenon of light fright and mic fright, and that is what I am subject to, and I am speechless. Although public interest showed little sign of diminishing, the Washington hearings were anticlimactic next to witness testimony from New York. A weary Kefauver and a battle-worn crime committee started to wind down their public hearings with their last open hearings in DC in March and April '51. Kefauver had reluctantly been forced into the negative role of circus ringmaster as he attempted to control not only his committee and the witnesses which appeared before it every day, but juggle the requests and demands of the television stations, newsreel companies, and radio and television reporters still keen for a story before the investigations came to a close. In the Crime Committee's final report delivered to Congress, a section is devoted to the use of television, newsreels, and radio in congressional hearings, and as the first congressional committee to encounter television on an extensive scale, it offered its experiences and conclusions in the event that an overall code of procedure might be employed in future televised congressional hearings. In February 1952, the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences awarded the hearings an Emmy for special achievement for their outstanding public service and for bringing the workings of our government into the homes of the American people. In a speech delivered later in that same year, Kefauver told the Academy, "It was television that sharply focused public attention and indignation on the crime and corruption now being exposed. In that regard, television, can serve as a powerful instrument for good, clean government." Glory on television, however, is short-lived. 1 month after the hearings concluded, coverage of General Douglas MacArthur's trip from Korea to address Congress was referred as television's biggest and best effort, and all the underworld figures across the nation breathed a sigh of relief as the TV lights stopped focusing on them and they could return to the shadows. Television had needed Kefauver's crime committee to show that it could run responsible programming within the public interest, whereas Kefauver needed a medium that could reach across America, educating the public and raising awareness of the crime committee's cause. The consequent raising of his own political reputation through a well-publicised and successful Senate investigation turned out to be beneficial for the next state elections and also promoted him towards higher public office. The committee's investigations were sensational. Television, a fastly expanding novelty, and a medium in its own right, the two fit perfectly together. At the start of 1950, Senator Kefauver's reputation had not extended far beyond the confines of Tennessee. He was not loud, he was not a showman, he was not a master of the gimmick. He had a quiet, almost shy demeanour, which tended to hide his intelligence and veracity from opponents until it was far too late. As one opponent remarked after a slam-bam floor fight in the Senate, "Kefauver gets up with that slow drawl of his, talking so softly you can hardly hear him. You lean forward to catch his words, and you discover he's quietly beating your brains out." By the following year, the anonymous senator from Tennessee was an American household name. At the pinnacle of his crime committee's investigation, the New York phase of the hearings, Kefauver appeared on a very different sort of television programming. The first question asked, "Are you in the entertainment business?" And as the applause and studio laughter subsided, a disguised voice answers, "No, ma'am." The cross-examination continues, "Are you in the public eye?" "Slightly." "Have you ever been on TV?" "Yes," responds the muffled voice. As the questioning continues, it becomes clear that the voice belongs to someone who appears on a rather special type of program. Further questions reveal he is a senator and is mixed up in a currently high-profile investigation. The final question is, "Are you on the right side of this investigation?" And Senator Estes Kefauver responds with the quip, "I hope so." Thus, Senator Kefauver's debut on the commercially sponsored television quiz show What's My Line, broadcast over the CBS network, failed to stump the panel of experts gathered to guess his occupation. They were allowed up to 10 no answers before they had to make their identification. The panel only used 3. Kefauver had become a nationwide name and America's first political TV celebrity. Audiences continued to be alarmed by the threat of organised crime and by the spate of televised, factual crime programmes that appeared in the wake of the Senate crime probe. The public's alarm was being fed by a wider malaise stemming from the external threats of communism prompted by the escalation of war in Korea, and by Senator Joe McCarthy's fear that this external threat had already infiltrated the State Department. During the Red Scare period, and with the ongoing dangers of blacklisting, television programme makers may not have wanted to spotlight any element, good or bad, of the communist threat, but could symbolise similar fears through the less politically charged menace of organised crime. One CBS TV series that ran every Tuesday night at 9 from September 51 to June 53 was entitled Crime Syndicated. Every week the show would be introduced by a well-known crime-fighting celebrity. His or her introductory remarks on a different aspect of organised crime would be followed by a dramatic reconstruction of both the crime and law enforcement or government struggle to resolve the problem. Kefauver appeared as host narrator on 3 separate occasions in December of 51 and January of 52. And the Christmas show highlighted the problem of gangster influence on local law enforcement, with Kefauver making statements designed to persuade the public to act. The syndicate can and does try to buy public officials. They succeed where you let them. They fail where you stop them. Responsible citizens voting intelligently can always upset the racketeers' plans. This and the latter show appeared on the 2 days of the year when home audiences were considered highest. Again, detractors suggest that Kefauver was once again highlighting his anti-crime platform for viewers, and the timing of these appearances on the show coincided with his announcement 3 weeks later to seek the Democratic nomination for president. For each show, Kefauver was awarded a $2,000 fee, which was paid directly to the Cordell Hull Foundation for World Peace. Although criticism grew with every new example of how politics could lead to show business, other ex-crime committee staff remained somewhat more stage-struck. Rudolph Halley, investigating counsel, appeared as a host on 18 occasions, whilst Senator Toby O'Connor made no less than 28 appearances, but for reportedly far less money than Kefauver. Fictional American crime series were also very popular on television during the 50s, and one of the earliest was Man Against Crime. On-screen violence was kept quite brief, with one good blow or shot deemed enough, but writers for Man Against Crime received plot instructions to keep the threat of violence near the surface. It's been found that we retain audience interest best when our story is concerned with murder. Therefore, although other crimes may be introduced, somebody must be murdered, preferably early on, with a threat of more violence to come. Other shows such as Stand By for Crime, Racket Squad and Mr. District Attorney followed the live production crime formula which Man Against Crime had helped develop. Film historian Eugene Rosso has suggested that during the 50s, particularly in the programmes and movies made for television, society was trying to reassure itself, since the policeman or G-man had become more prevalent than the gangster. It's not that the gangsters disappeared, they simply became the foe for the lead law enforcement characters rather than the central figures in their own shows. In reality, most Americans had relatively little exposure to crime and criminals as they actually exist in contemporary society. The same can be said for an audience's exposure to police detectives and law enforcement. 4 months after the factual programme Crime Syndicated first aired, a relatively new radio show made the transfer to television. Dragnet became a hit overnight and transformed the radio police show into a successful television genre. Like Crime Syndicated, it could be considered a factual show rather than fictional, since it developed its storylines using actual cases from the LAPD files and California court cases. Dragnet was an anti-crime, semi-documentary style programme produced independently by Jack Webb, a leading conservative, and it aired prime time on NBC. It combined straightforwardness and simplified motives with a highly moralistic tone and was well received by teen audiences. It also became the first television crime drama to be shot on film, and a benchmark by which subsequent police shows would be judged. Dragnet's producer, director and creator Jack Webb also starred as the lead character Sergeant Joe Friday. Webb often accompanied real police on their nightly rounds and became fascinated by the way the real policemen talked and by police procedure. The television series first aired in 1952 as a weekly black and white half-hour show, and it ran until 1959, winning a total of 4 Emmys along the way. Dragnet emphasised authentic police jargon, technical aspects of law enforcement, and the drudgery of police work. But unlike Man Against Crime and other television shows, Dragnet was not a violent show. Rather than engaging in fistfights and gunplay, violence was usually depicted after the fact, showing the consequences of violence rather than glamorising it. In fact, in a year's worth of episodes, Jack Webb commented that only 15 bullets were fired and only 3 fistfights took place. More common were scenes of the detective simply waiting and engaging in mundane small talk, and these added to the realistic atmosphere. By 1954, 56% of the national population made up television's audience, and more than half of these households regularly watched Dragnet. In the latter half of the 50s, Cecil Smith wrote the regular television column The TV Scene for the Los Angeles Times. In February of 1958, his column was entitled Shows on Kefauver Probe, proving that although over 7 years had passed, the sensationalism of the Kefauver hearings had not faded from either the television industry or the public's memories, and in fact had been shaping the crime storylines used by television shows and feature films. One of the shows reviewed by the columnist was a crime show, Tide of Corruption, and it appeared heavily based on the 1950-51 crime probe. It added up to a satisfactory melodrama, according to Cecil Smith. Intrigued, the office of Estes Kefauver sent a request for the copy of the script. The script duly arrived, and an anonymous aide to Kefauver, after reading the script, passed it to Kefauver, remarking in a memo that the script seems a dud in all respects. In Tide of Corruption, the names of key figures have obviously been changed, but characters are clearly recognisable. Senator Digby is based on Kefauver. Ed Robert is the new name for Chief Counsel Rudolph Halley. Anthony Castle is based on Frank Costello. And even Virginia Hill, newly christened as Carolyn Mann, turns up. When Carolyn Mann is giving testimony in front of a televised crime hearing, Carolyn Mann, her scenes mirror the televised crime hearing footage of Virginia Hill's verbal attacks against the barrage of photographers attempting to take a picture as she appears before the investigation. Sorry, I've gone wrong here. Anyway, Tide of Corruption follows closely the testimony, and the testimony is used throughout as dialogue, so that there's not, the story comes directly from testimony from the New York hearings. So in the 50s, 2 programs dominate the television crime genre. The first is, as we just discussed, Dragnet, which appeared early on in the decade in 52, and the other accepted the perceived conventions of the law enforcement television program, followed Dragnet's semi-documentary style, but understood that Dragnet had saturated the market in police procedural, and that a new subject area needed to be explored for serious success. The new television show's subject matter was based on 30s nostalgia, and The Untouchables, as it was titled, sparked off its own cycle of nostalgic crime shows as its popularity grew and ratings soared. The programme ignored contemporary law enforcement characters that had become well known to a 1950s audience for enforcers from an historical past, and the show looked back to Prohibition and the 20s and 30s. Its key cast members were based on the US Treasury's Special Prohibition agent Elliot Ness and his elite team of incorruptible agents, and they'd battle with well-known 30s figures of organised crime in Chicago, such as Frank Nitti and Al Capone. Joseph Bruce Gorman suggests mistakenly that compared with the television industry's clamour for guest appearances by the committee members of the Senate Crime Probe and the wealth of crime-influenced storylines which consequently appeared on television after the hearings, Hollywood was less interested in cashing in on the crime investigation. But this simply wasn't true. It's perhaps that senators and the staff of the committee, so eager to appear in the debates and documentary dramatisations on television, were wary of appearing in feature films that would be fictional, even sensationalised, and likely to appear a lot less serious and less respectable to the viewing public. In fact, the Senate crime hearings influenced and inspired a renaissance of crime crusading films, as Hollywood rushed to film crime exposés which would draw in an audience whose appetite had already been whetted by the stories appearing in newspapers and on radio and television. I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nerys. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'll give people a moment to perhaps write some questions into the chat function. But firstly, I wanted to just ask you a few things. Obviously, my interest in film is going to come through a little bit here, but I find it just extraordinary to consider the impact that the hearings had on not just viewing patterns in terms of television, but people's leisure patterns, working patterns, shopping patterns. This is extraordinary to consider. And I'm just thinking of the Hollywood studio bosses who are looking at television and absolutely terrified about the impact it's going to have in general, and then watching this unfolding as a phenomenon. And it's interesting, you mentioned how some cinemas address that by screening excerpts from the hearings to try and bring back some of that audience. But I wondered as well, just in relation to some of the interconnections between cinema and television. You mentioned the film noir lighting techniques that would have been, of course, well known to post-World War II audiences, where they would have recognized and been able to decode the fact that certain lighting techniques symbolized criminality or impending imprisonment. And to be able to map that onto television and for that to be used as some of the techniques, that's really fascinating. And clearly there are interesting implications here, I think, for how maybe the hearings fed back into Hollywood. It's clear the impact on television, but was there an interconnection there in terms of what we see later coming out of Hollywood in relation to what people were exposed to in watching the hearings?
Yeah, definitely. If I had a 3-hour talk planned, I would cover all of the film section. When I was talking about television, there are two distinct cycles in that the one follows very closely real life. So once people see what's happening on these the gangsters in real life on television through when giving testimony, that is clearly shown in things like Dragnet, Man Against Crime. When you go into Hollywood, although when the crime hearings are being actually televised, it's affecting cinema, it actually helps create a whole new subcycle of the gangster genre, which becomes known as the syndicate cycle. Because no longer can you continue to show things that you've shown in the 30s and 40s, because now people have got a much better idea of what this criminal kind of underworld looks like, because they've been watching it on TV in what they consider to be like a real thing. So you get the syndicate cycle, which remakes the original gangster into shady businessmen. They're corrupting local politicians, they're corrupting the local city elders to bend to their will. And so you get films such, well, it starts with Humphrey Bogart's film The Enforcer in I think 1951, that one. And then there's The Racket, the System. My favorite is Captive City, which actually has Kefauver gives a prologue and an epilogue to the film, because he's so caught up in the Captive City and thinking that it'll help audiences understand. Then there's also Hoodlum Empire, which again takes testimony directly from the hearings and mirrors some of the characters and on both sides of like law and order and crime to kind of tell a story. So a lot of the films that come out in Hollywood that connect to this syndicate cycle are B movies. They're made, you know, quick money, low budget, but what happens is they add conventions to the gangster genre, and then you get an A-list movie come out, which hopefully some of you have seen, is On the Waterfront. On the Waterfront takes a lot of these things to do with shadowy background figures and, you know, mafia controlling things like labor unions, and puts it into an A-list movie, which I think On the Waterfront got 12 nominations for Oscars and won about 8 of them, something like that, like a real A-list movie. So most of the syndicate are B movies, but there are some really cracking things that come out of it.
And I think that the persona of Kefauver is fascinating as well, because here he's constructed in a way that couldn't have been anticipated perhaps before television. But again, there's an interconnection there with cinema too, as you mentioned his introduction to Captive City. And Catherine has asked, can you say more about his involvement with the film?
Well, he originally he was supposed to be involved with The Enforcer, and he'd been asked to give some kind of epilogue or some and kind of endorse the film, and he was up for it. He was very good about, he never took any money that was offered. He always donated to charities and things, but then he saw a rough cut of the film and thought The Enforcer was so awful he didn't want anything to do with it, so he cut all ties. So even though in some of the early publicity his name was mentioned, by the time it came out he cut ties completely. The Captive City film, him and his wife were traveling in California, and they were shown a rough cut of a movie called The Tightrope, which they changed the name to Captive City, and he thought this was much more his style. It, directed by Robert Wise, it starred a very young John Forsyth, and it was about a crusading newspaper editor who is trying to report on corruption in a small, it's not even set in a big city, it's small town America, which is much more scary for American public to view. And they go on the run, and they think that murdering comrades are going to try and kill them before they can testify before the hearings. And so Kefauver gives a prologue to the movie, encouraging people to watch it. He's in all the publicity materials, and then his final words are said as if, I don't want to give it away in case you watch the movie, but as if that they have arrived at the Senate hearing and they're hearing Kefauver through the doors. It's kind of nice the way they do the ending. But he's very much involved in that film.
There's something really interesting here as well in terms of the connections between news and what we might be defining current affairs and entertainment. And look, the newsreels are really guilty of kind of going for an entertainment angle in the cinema, but this absolute wave of capturing the imagination of the public by televising these hearings had to have something to do, obviously, with that entertainment level. And were there any debates at the time about the ethics or the morality associated with this?
Well, you wanna think that maybe they were the TV cameras were manipulating the images in some way, but they didn't. It was selling itself. These characters were turning up, larger than life, some of them, and it was feeding into everything you thought you might know about kind of the criminal underworld, because we're talking as if the hearings are the way people are learning about it, but they know about it already. They've read it in the newspapers. It's been reported on for years, but now they're seeing it, and it's real life, and it's not staged, you know. And it really, I gave you a couple of things about blood drives and things like that, but as it moved from city to city, it basically shut cities down. People were so interested in what was going on, and it was such an exciting event to happen when it came to your city.
It's really astounding to consider that. But also, I think what's interesting here, and I hope you don't mind if I ask a methodological question here, there's so much coming together in terms of sources here. You know, you're looking at broadcast television, you're looking at politics, you're looking at newspapers, you're looking at a new format in terms of this means of entertaining and informing the public through televising the hearings. And you're looking at transcripts as well. There's so much here, and I wondered, if you might say something on methodology and gathering all those sources, but also, is there a change in landscape now in relation to accessing some of this information in the digital era? And one of the things I always lament a little bit about the digital era is the lack of perhaps interaction with an archivist, because a really good archivist can open up treasures to you that you may never find otherwise. So sorry, that's a bit convoluted, but I wondered if you could say something just about gathering all of those sources and accessing them.
Well, so this research, I have been looking at this area since I did my, this is what my PhD was on. I've been looking at this area for nearly 20 years. And when, I'm going to show my age now. When I first started looking at this, I didn't have Google, there was no internet. Everything was done by going to a library, looking through Rolodex, that kind of thing. So the testimony, I was in the States for 6 months reading up on this stuff. I read a lot of the testimony when I was in the States because they had it in the libraries there and I couldn't access it over here. And a lot of these things, especially in my PhD, I wrote quite a lot about the film The Captive City, but I'd never actually seen it. I was working off stills from the BFI, I was working off reviews, I was working off all the promotional material. I'd managed to find a copy of the original screenplay in Kefauver's original papers and comments in his diary. So I had pieced it together what this film must have looked like. And then, you know, about 5 years ago, it's released on DVD. And if I look on YouTube now, I can see clips of it. There's interviews of the director, Robert Wise, talking about it. It's all accessible now. But back then you did have to piece these things together to try and, you know, find all this information. I was telling a story the other day about how I was in the British Film Institute reading room and I knew about these syndicate movies and I knew about Kefauver's hearings and I was trying to make some connection between the two. And this was before I went to the States to the archives there. And I found this full-page spread for The Captive City promotional poster, and it was a beautiful poster. And then in the tiny, tiny fine print at the bottom, it said Estes Kefauver's, you know, monetary donation has been made to. And suddenly I found the link between Kefauver and these syndicate films. Here he is connected to this film. And it's one of those eureka moments as a researcher. So I'm in the British Film Institute silently cheering. And everyone's looking at me like, what's she doing? And then far on the other side, there's another historian who just put his thumbs up, as in, you found something good. But now, like, just to do the slides, I knew that he'd been on What's My Line, and I knew I'd read all the TV reports about that. And then now you can go to YouTube and you can watch that original episode of What's My Line and see him doing the talk and hear it all. So today's researchers, it's so in front of them that they might miss out some of the snippets that going through, you know, basement archives and getting to know people who really know their sources, you know, you might miss out some of that.
And missing out those eureka moments then as well.
Yeah.
So important.
Because
okay,
too easy, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to ask pose some questions from the audience now. So Chris Emmerson has asked, do you think the spectacle of televised hearings led later filmmakers to use this setting deliberately rather than, say, courtroom settings for organised crime? Couldn't help thinking of the set piece of Frank's testimony in Godfather 2.
So definitely Godfather 2 is one of the key films that years on from Kefauver has Senate hearings. Is it Pagnelli is supposed to say something and he's kept quiet, and then there's the testimony and everything. It's all there. It is stemming from Kefauver. It's also stemming from there's other hearings that follow Kefauver. So Kefauver is in like 50, 51. Then in 57 you have, I think it's the McClellan hearings, which the investigator prosecutor for that is Robert Kennedy, and they're looking at labor racketeering. And then is it the Valachi hearings? There's another set of hearings that probably, I would say Kefauver, and then another set of hearings in the very early 70s is probably what The Godfather is looking at. But this idea of Senate hearings and organised crime links, you see it a lot in movies. I think actually even in one of the Sopranos episodes there's something where they've got to do it. And it becomes, well, as in all gangster films, every new gangster film gives a new convention to the genre. And the syndicate films all have this Senate testimony as the convention that they're giving.
And we have a question coming through now from Catherine on the fashion element. You were talking about the classic femme fatale. Is there a kind of feedback loop on how to dress like a gangster between media and real life?
Well, Virginia Hilshouser is a very interesting character, and she did look very Hollywood with her blooming stole. And whereas I think the picture I showed, she looked quite like she was trying to look quite serious, but there's pictures of her outside of the courthouse where she's putting on a show for the photographers. Then she decides she's had enough. She beats off one of them with her handbag. It's just kind of, she always looks fantastic. And I think if you look at gangsters' moles in the movies, they're not always in the dark suit. So they're saying quite often, the reporter said she wasn't treating it with the solemnness she should have, but she was wearing a dark suit, like she had come dressed for a funeral, you know, dark suit, black hat kind of thing. So yeah, she was mirroring the Hollywood starlet though in the way she posed for photographs outside.
And a question from Leanne. I was interested in the idea of how film has to change the reality of how gangsters were portrayed. Was this something that impacted other types of films where real life had to be reflected? Did this mark a change in film?
So I definitely think that these televised hearings changed the way Hollywood had to represent the gangster. In the early 1930s, the gangster had often been quite an ethnic criminal, and then during World War II, to have ethnics as the aliens in society and the criminal element was seen as bad. So all during the war years, criminals became WASP characters, white characters, and that continued through the 40s. So you have Dillinger and that kind of thing. It's all about kind of the white outlaws. But once, and people got used to that. That's what they expected to see. It's white outlaws and white criminals again. So Jimmy Cagney and things like that. But once you saw these real life gangster type characters, I mean, I talked about the key people, but there were so many of them through the testimony. A lot of them had very poor English. A lot of them had very thick accents. They looked, a lot of them looked Italian, Greek, you know, very Mediterranean looking. And it made, if you want to make a gangster character believable in the 50s and you're setting it in a contemporary time, you need to start making your gangster characters ethnic again. And that's what you find. And so then if you don't want to do that and you want to go back, you have to look nostalgically back. So that's why you get two real cycles in the 50s. The syndicate films, which are showing contemporary events, and the nostalgic looks back. So you get films like Machine Gun Kelly, Bonnie Parker Story, Pretty Boy Floyd, which are all looking back to the criminals of the 20s and the 30s, so that they don't have to show the reality that people are expecting from the 50s anymore. They could go back to the mythic type of gangster. Not sure if I answered the Anne there, but
and a question from Daphne. I am fascinated about the influence of these movies, TV series, and public attitudes towards labour unions. How did this work with the Hollywood connections with unions?
It worked carefully. There was a movie, I can't remember the name of it at the moment, which looks at unions within Hollywood, but it's a B movie and not very well known. And I think it's the kind, especially in the 50s when you're trying to avoid anything to do with communism and Red Scare, and unionizing was seen as being a bit socialist. So being in a union was considered quite a bad thing. You don't often get the Hollywood portrayal of unions within Hollywood, but you did get things like the stevedores on the waterfront, and there's other films in the late 50s that are looking at is it I Mobster, I think, has some stuff to do with labour unions and racketeering and that kind of thing. So there are films that show it.
And a comment from Philip I was intrigued by the headshot, handshot material and how that positions the subject witness. I mean, those were fascinating sequences and just how the way you described how utterly engaging it was to watch this man's hands, and that they were a clue to his inner turmoil and everything else that was going on. And there's something, although it's television, there's something quite cinematic in that as well. Again, it's almost as if there is an acknowledgement of what's on the screen and how it's positioned, not just because he had been asked to be beheaded, so to speak, but that there's something in this that the audience is responding to as drama. They're responding to this in the way they might respond to suspense or a build-up of tension in a mainstream Hollywood film.
Well, he on that first day, the first day when all the pictures are based on his hands, he's obviously just not got a clue on how he's representing himself. You're so busy controlling what you say and how you look and your facial features, you forget that your hands just are reflecting the nervous energy that's obviously coursing through you. He does come back on another day and his hands stay for the majority below the desk. He's obviously been told, right, you can't do that. And he is the kingpin. Frank Costello is the king of the mafia of New York. So to show the nerves like this must have affected him, internally within his organization. Because what I didn't say was there is a great picture of mob boss Joe Adonis. Reporters went to Joe Adonis to see what he thought of these hearings, and they managed to catch Joe Adonis watching Costello on television. And there's a great photograph of Joe Adonis sitting in his living room in an armchair watching TV, and all you can see is Costello's hands. And this becomes such a convention of the gangster genre, this picture, because it's shown again in Hoodlum Empire. It's shown again in On the Waterfront. I think it might be in The Godfather as well. I'm not sure about The Godfather. It's definitely shown in On the Waterfront as well, as the big cheese, the big shadowy figure at the top watching what's going on the TV. So.
And Philip follows up with a comment. They're just following up on the headshot issue. The Nazis had used similar shot techniques in their filming of concentration camp inmates. I wonder if there's a subliminal connection. And I'll just pose one final question to you from Claire. I wonder whether the absence of facial image changed how audiences responded to, trusted him. Is there any information about that?
Well, I don't think anybody trusted him anyway, because he was like an organised crime kingpin. But I definitely think this person who had been considered to be scary, all-powerful, showed he was a human after all. He showed his vulnerable side, and I don't have any record of how that affected him within his criminal kind of underworld. I'm sure he might have had to knock some heads together to re-earn his respect there, but definitely within the public, he was made fun of because of this. All the newspapers reported on it. Jack Gould being his columns on all of this is really interesting, but they all were reporting on it.
Thanks so much, Nerys. I think we're going to have to draw things to a close there, and hopefully you'll be able to see all the wonderful comments praising your lecture afterwards. And at this point, I'll hand back over to Catherine to bring the proceedings to a close.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Kira.
Ned, thank you so much. That was really a fantastic lecture. Really just fascinating from start to finish, and I have lots more questions for you, which I'll bore you with over WhatsApp later. And thank you too so much for that fantastic chairing. The questions were brilliant. I would like to invite everyone to unmute themselves, and you can show your videos as well, just to show Ned a big round of applause and our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Ned, I think you need a well-deserved drink. I wish we could take you out for a big shop-up meal and some wine. Hopefully we'll be able to do that very soon. But in the meantime, everyone, look after yourselves, stay safe, and thank you very much again. Thank you very, very much for that fantastic 50th anniversary lecture. Thanks. I'm going to end the session now. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Bye.